Bien, Monsieur le Président, Monsieur le Secrétaire Général, Mesdames et Messieurs, nous allons essayer d'ouvrir ce panel. Je dois tout d'abord remercier les organisateurs de cette journée d'avoir songé à associer la Commission des Nations Unies pour le droit commercial international, que je représente, à cette journée festive de célébration des 90 ans d'UNIDROIT. La CNUTSI, comme certains, presque tous le savent, n'a elle-même que 50 ans cette année. Nous serons donc toujours de 40 ans en retard sur nos grands devanciers de l'UNIDROIT. On m'a demandé d'animer cette séance. Bon, naturellement, d'un bon président de séance, on attend surtout qu'il ne dise pas grand-chose par lui-même, ensuite qu'il fasse taire les orateurs après la fin du temps qui leur a été imparti et qu'il laisse un peu de temps pour les questions et les échanges avec la salle. J'essaierai de respecter sérieusement ces trois contraintes. Si je peux prendre toutefois 2 minutes, je voudrais dire un mot sur le thème de ce panel et encore une fois saluer la clairvoyance des organisateurs de cette réunion qui, en associant la CNUTSI, l'organe que je représente, les Nations Unies, à cette session, ont évité de le faire sur les aspects les plus techniques et aussi les plus quotidiens de la coopération entre UNIDROIT et la CNUTSI, une coopération qui, comme la plupart d'entre vous le savent, est faite de complémentarité des normes élaborées dans nos deux organisations, parfois d'amicale et saine concurrence, parfois également d'échange de personnel, puisque nous avons une histoire de recrutement croisé de certains membres dirigeants de nos deux organisations. Mais ce n'est pas de tout cela que nous allons parler. Nous allons parler de l'activité de la CNUTSI et des Nations Unies en relation avec la fabrique du droit commercial international dans une perspective de promotion de l'état de droit. État de droit, notion assez peu française finalement, qui traduit assez mal le rule of law anglais, mais qui, sous une forme ou sous une autre, se trouve assez largement promu par l'Organisation des Nations Unies, puisqu'on retrouve la promotion de l'état de droit aussi bien parmi les objectifs du millénaire que parmi les objectifs des Nations Unies pour le développement durable. Et c'est une activité constamment poursuivie par le secrétariat de la CNUTSI que de faire comprendre, mais ce ne devrait pas être difficile dans cette salle, mais de faire comprendre aux diplomates qui généralement représentent leurs États dans l'Organisation des Nations Unies que la promotion de l'état de droit, ce n'est pas seulement la mise en place d'un ordonnancement juridique et juridictionnel satisfaisant, ça n'est pas seulement la qualité de la vie dans les prisons et le maintien d'un minimum de normes en matière de droits de l'homme. La promotion de l'état de droit, c'est aussi un instrument important pour le développement économique et social, et notamment ces considérations techniques que nous poursuivons dans nos deux organisations lorsque nous nous occupons de droit de l'arbitrage, de droit des marchés publics, de droit des sûretés, que sais-je. Ces développements, tous plus techniques les uns que les autres, ont, au moins dans la perspective des Nations Unies, un seul but, qui est de promouvoir la paix et la sécurité et le développement. Je suis donc particulièrement heureux de me trouver aujourd'hui entre deux orateurs qui vont pouvoir développer des aspects, là encore, différents et complémentaires de cet état de choses. Et je donnerai la parole successivement à Madame Vinhoven, qui représente le Global Compact. Le Global Compact étant une institution mise en place auprès des Nations Unies pour représenter le secteur privé et faire comprendre que les synergies méritent d'être développées aussi bien du côté des pouvoirs publics que du secteur privé, sans perdre de vue l'idée qu'un commerce équitable, un commerce ouvert aux droits de l'homme et au développement durable, ce peut être aussi un commerce qui fait de bonnes affaires. Nous entendrons également le professeur Wallace. Le professeur Wallace est l'une des rares personnes en activité qui a été à la CNUDSI, qui se trouve auprès de la CNUDSI depuis plus longtemps que moi, et qui donc sait absolument tout sur ce que fait la CNUDSI pratiquement depuis les origines. Mais il nous parlera aujourd'hui d'une de ses spécialités, le droit des marchés publics et le droit du financement privé de projets d'infrastructure, en particulier dans ce qu'ils peuvent avoir d'important pour la lutte contre la corruption. J'avais promis de ne pas parler longtemps, je me tais, et je donne la parole à Madame Vinhoven en lui demandant de parler pendant une vingtaine de minutes. Merci.
Thank you very much to UNIDROIT and also UNCITRAL for the invitation and opportunity to join this panel and an event. And happy anniversary to UNIDROIT, and thank you so much for sharing your special occasion with us all. I'm going to speak about the role of business in support of the rule of law, why business should care, and what they can do to support it. And this is in the context of work that the United Nations Global Compact, with the guidance of an international multi-stakeholder steering group, has done at the request of UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. In September 2013, he tasked the UN's Corporate Sustainability Initiative to develop a framework for business engagement in support of the rule of law. And after an extensive international consultation in 19 cities around the world, this framework was concluded last June. And in December, the UN General Assembly took note of the framework in A-Res 70224. Since I suspect not everyone here is familiar with the Global Compact, I will share some key facts and figures as context for our work in this area of business and the rule of law. It was established in mid-2000, and last year marked its 15-year anniversary. So we're just a teenager compared to UNIDROIT's elder status. Our mandate comes from the UN General Assembly and specifically is to promote responsible business practices and UN values among the global business community as well as the UN system. And it's a call to businesses everywhere, regardless of size or sector, to align operations and strategies with 10 universally accepted principles in the areas of human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. And to take action in support of UN goals. And finally, to report annually to their stakeholders on their progress in doing so. It currently has 13,000 signatories from 160 countries. Of these, 8,000 are companies and SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, and there's country networks in about 85 countries. This makes the Global Compact the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative, but that's clearly not enough. It's just scratching the surface of the private sector in the world. So the UN Secretary General has issued the challenge to grow to 20,000 participants by 2020. Corporate sustainability can mean different things to different people. Synonyms include corporate responsibility, corporate citizenship, even corporate social responsibility. And traditionally, many of these terms had a strong either environmental focus or philanthropic dimension. However, the way we define corporate sustainability is definitely not limited to these elements. It's a company's creation of long-term value in economic, social, environmental, and ethical terms. So it's quadruple bottom line in this respect. While the definition speaks about value creation, baked in, though, is the idea that business will take responsibility for its impacts and not diminish value or cause harm. Various actors, including business, but also local and state governments, academia, and NGOs, joined the initiative by pledging their commitment to the 10 principles. And the 10 principles themselves have a unique universality and legitimacy because they come from the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the the UN Convention Against Corruption, the ILO Declaration on Fundamental Principles of Right to Work, and the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development. And all Global Compact participants are required to publicly disclose the progress they make in implementing the 10 principles and broader UN goals on an annual basis if they're companies and on a biannual basis if they're non-business. This particular requirement advances transparency and accountability and provides safeguards for the integrity of the initiative and the efforts of the participants who are in it. There are a range of work streams which you can see on the bottom left-hand side there on priorities for business and the United Nations, including human rights, women's empowerment, climate, water, food, anti-corruption, peace, and last but definitely not least, rule of law. So the particular vision is to promote a more sustainable and inclusive global economy. And there are two specific objectives that are grounded in concepts of respect on the one hand and support on the other. So the respect dimension, this reflects that the minimum, the baseline standard for business behavior focuses on the compliance, on the do no harm aspect. And it also highlights the importance of internalizing the 10 principles into a business's culture, strategy, operations, and their business relationships. Support, on the other hand, this is additional voluntary actions that go beyond respect to seek to advance UN goals by making a positive contribution. And this can be a positive contribution through core business activities, strategic social investment or philanthropy, advocacy, public policy engagement, and partnerships and other forms of collective action. And Business for the Rule of Law is primarily focused on this support dimension, but it does also reinforce the message that for business, the minimum is to respect and uphold the rule of law. While the UN system engages with the private sector in various ways, the Global Compact is the main UN initiative for engagement with business on both their responsibilities and the opportunities. And a major example of this was the key role played in mobilizing business engagement into the post-2015 development agenda. And now that we have Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals, helping to translate those goals for companies with tools and resources that help companies to understand their role. Because the SDGs are mutually reinforcing and interwoven, and the approaches to meet them themselves are interconnected, and all societal actors will have a key role to play to make progress. The UN Deputy Secretary General has said that the SDGs are a declaration of interdependence. With this set of goals, it's not just about what companies can do to support them, but how the goals can also be a lighthouse for companies in their self-enlightened interest in setting their own long-term corporate goals and implementation for their own long-term viability. The achievement of the SDGs will be enormously beneficial to business. Among other things, businesses want better governance, peace and stability to create an improved enabling environment for business to function. In addition, the SDGs themselves are an incredible tool for business to use as a beacon for the next 15 years, showing the direction that all the countries in the world will be striving towards. In addition to providing a comprehensive framework for sustainable development, the SDGs will shape stakeholder expectations, policy directions, investment flows. They offer the opportunity to align business goals with widely endorsed global goals for society at large. And they provide a common framework and language for reporting and communication and engagement with stakeholders. And they also present an opportunity to support employee engagement to connect their work to broader purpose and goals. This set of sustainable development goals and the investment from all sectors into realizing them also point the way to many business opportunities. Sustainability is here to stay as an agenda, and the main question left for companies is when will any given company align? What stance does it want to take, to be a market leader or a late adopter? Issues like Ebola, Zika, climate change, the refugee crisis, rising inequality within countries, terrorism, the list goes on. Companies are not islands operating independently of the challenges and opportunities in the societies they operate in. Increasingly, responsible businesses are stepping up to play their role as a complement to government action. So where are companies at in engaging with the SDGs? Our research has found that 68% are already aware of them. However, being realistic at this stage, we suspect this is because the people who answered the survey are the sustainability people. So there's clearly a lot more translation and communication to be done to engage business more fully on this agenda. But we're not doing so bad since they just came into effect on 1 January. Interestingly, companies in emerging markets are leading in embracing the SDGs. This diagram shows the percentage out of 100 that have varying degrees of awareness of the SDGs, and the darkest blue is the percentage of those that are actually also already planning their response. As we all know, SDG 16 is focused on promoting peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, providing access to justice for all, and building effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. It includes promoting the rule of law nationally and internationally. The Global Compact has 3 work streams which support responsible businesses trying to help achieve Goal 16: anti-corruption, business for peace, and business for the rule of law. So what specifically is business's role when it comes to the SDGs, whether on Goal 16 or more generally? Well, in a nutshell, it's to be a sustainable business. Namely, that means to act responsibly and to find opportunity by transforming business models in line with the SDGs. So first, on the act responsibly part, businesses should do no harm as the baseline minimum standard. They should comply with national law and international standards in all these areas to earn their social license to operate. This means that companies should not undermine the achievement of any of the SDGs through their business actions and the externalities that their business cause or contributes to. But then secondly, finding opportunity this is the dimension focused on making a positive contribution and creating shared value for business and society in support of these issues. In the various ways I mentioned before, the core business, the philanthropy, the advocacy, collective action. This typically means that companies identify and take action on the most significant and strategic SDGs for their particular business, given their sector, where they operate, their size, etc., and setting corporate goals that contribute to sustainable development. Really importantly, though, there's a key relationship between this act responsibly and find opportunity. It's a plus sign, not a plus-minus sign. Businesses should make sure they don't give with one hand while taking with the other. So with that context and acting on an emerging trend that responsible companies are growing more aware of the impact of weak rule of law on their ability to conduct their businesses in a sustainable and responsible way, the Global Compact accepted the challenge from the UN Secretary-General to explore how business action in support of the rule of law could help to reinforce the 10 principles and what businesses could do in partnership with others in areas like access to justice, strengthening of legal systems, responsible advocacy and law reform, and institutional capacity building. So to deliver the framework, we worked with partners and country networks to conduct these 19 locally owned workshops with businesses, civil society, and others. And in a nutshell, as the consultations, interviews, desk research, and more than 120 examples gathered of business action in support of the rule of law, responsible businesses are motivated to take action to respect and support the rule of law where they operate. They also want justice, fairness, certainty, legal identity, a level playing field, robust legal frameworks, and accountable and effective institutions. One of the major aspects of the framework is the working definition of rule of law for businesses, to demystify rule of law for businesses. There was growing realization by business that the rule of law is essential for sustainable and inclusive economic growth and providing an enabling environment for responsible business to support it. It provides the foundation for respecting and supporting the 10 principles and the SDGs. Among other things, the rule of law promotes economic investment by improving governance, peace, and security, increasing contractual certainty, and allowing for timely, fair, transparent, and predictable resolution of disputes, all things that companies want. In addition, the rule of law creates opportunities by making it easier for responsible business to set up and expand its operations, have clarity on property ownership, and providing access to new resources, human capital, and consumer markets, and a level playing field on which to compete. Finally, the rule of law ensures legal identity and empowerment of individuals and organizations otherwise overlooked that may be in a company's value chain, allowing for greater economic and social participation and managing risk. Given the importance of the rule of law to business, more and more business leaders recognize that they have a vital part to play in respecting and supporting the rule of law, as a complement to, not as a substitute, of course, for government's role. So what makes supporting the rule of law different from respecting the rule of law? Well, respecting the rule of law includes actions such as respecting the 10 principles of the Global Compact, complying with laws and regulations throughout the company's operations and value chain, and requiring and supporting business partners to do the same. Complying with tax law and policies, honouring contractual obligations and commercial agreements, and honouring dispute resolution procedures and decisions at all levels. The framework describes a variety of actions that companies can take to support the rule of law and provides examples of actions that some businesses have already taken. These are just a few of the 120 examples that we gathered to illustrate how business is already supporting the rule of law. They range from creating databases of national laws, providing legal services to obtain legal identity for individuals and companies, assisting prosecutors with resources to prosecute traffickers, support for building capacity of the legal profession and judiciary, advocacy in support of law reform and rights issues in line with international standards, and innovating goods and services that help to close rule of law gaps. To be sustainable, the Global Compact has identified 5 specific things that businesses must do. The first is principled business. Any company seeking to be sustainable begins by operating with integrity, respecting fundamental responsibilities in the areas of the 10 principles. This also ensures that business is not undermining the rule of law. Secondly, strengthening society. Sustainable companies look beyond their own walls and take actions to support the societies around them, knowing that their own success depends on the success of these societies. Action in support of the rule of law, as described in the framework, helps to build sustainable societies with benefit for society and business. Leadership commitment. Leadership must send a strong signal throughout the organisation that sustainability counts and that all responsibilities are important. Support for the rule of law is a business leadership opportunity. Reporting on progress. Reporting to stakeholders in a transparent and public manner is fundamental for companies committed to sustainability. Being transparent on a business's actions in support of the rule of law builds trust and legitimacy and also inspires other businesses to join the effort. And finally, local action. Companies with operations and supply chains extending around the world need to understand locations far from headquarters and view sustainability through a local lens. Global Compact local networks provide an invaluable opportunity to do this, as well as providing a forum for subsidiaries and local firms to work together, including on issues of business and the rule of law. So we'd like to invite you to engage with us and our local networks on business for the rule of law, to partner to identify rule of law gaps and needs, and to join forces to take action to help address them. So what's next? Well, a few launches have already been held, and plans are underway to hold many more locally owned launch events to help mobilise business in support of the rule of law and to continue to gather good examples of action to help inspire other businesses. And one of the things we found from the consultation very much so is that businesses were definitely keen to engage, but often they had a low level of knowledge about who's actually doing rule of law work that they could actually support. So I think there's a real opportunity there to increase information about the fantastic work that many in this room and their organisations are doing in support of the rule of law. So finally, I just wanted to flag that we developed this companion piece with General Counsel from around the world in recognition of how corporate General Counsel's role was evolving from merely advising on the legal aspects of a matter to being more of a trusted advisor and key guardian of their company's reputation on what is acceptable or right and not just on what is, fits within the law. This guide helps General Counsel understand and leverage their role in their company's corporate sustainability agenda, recognising that rule of law is a corporate sustainability issue that the General Counsel is most likely to lead on. Lawyers have a head start in understanding corporate sustainability agenda when they turn their minds to it, because we learnt back in law school about how we have responsibilities not just to clients, but also to the law and society at large. More and more corporate sustainability issues are hardening into law, whether on business implication and trafficking of persons or conflict minerals in the value chain. One of the key reasons lawyers can be leaders in sustainability within their companies is because they often have leadership roles and are relied on as advisors that are at the table when many important decisions affecting the company's sustainability are being made, and they have a role in making them. Also, they have issue spotting skills that are crucial in identifying and managing new risks. So in summary, in business's self-enlightened interest, there are good reasons for business action in support of the rule of law as a complement and not substitute for government action. Business support for the rule of law cannot substitute for failing to respect the rule of law in other areas, and responsible businesses are already taking action because they recognize that the weak rule of law undermines their business and ability to act responsibly. I think many of us know that law firms have been active in this area for a long time, but emerging as a new actor, supporter and voice in this space is other businesses. So we hope that the Business for the Rule of Law framework can also be useful for you to help engage more businesses in support of the crucial work that you're all doing. Thank you.
Well, I would very much thank Ms. Wijnhoven for this fascinating presentation, for making such precise use of the time that was given to her, and more importantly, for opening this window, or telling us about this new window opened by the UN General Assembly on the world of business. I'm sure there are questions already, but I would like to ask you please to hold those questions until after we hear our second speaker, Professor Wallace, please, for 20-25 minutes.
If you don't mind, I'm going to sit. Renaud, thank you very much, and thank you, UNIDROIT. The topic of my short talk, session 3, is called Commercial Law and the Rule of Law. Then the subtitle is A Level Playing Field to Counter Corruption, the Importance of Fair and Transparent Public Procurement. Really 4 topics: rule of law, commercial law, corruption, and procurement. I'm going to talk principally about procurement. But just a few words about the other. First of all, the rule of law. Of course, it's substance, and it's many things to, and we heard a great deal about it from Ms. Wijnhoven. I suppose it means governance, it means enforceable contracts, it means property rights, it means an awful lot of things to lawyers. I think there's something else, namely what makes it more likely we'll have the rule of law, and procurement really touches as much on the latter. Good public administration, legal skills, competence, ability to draft instruments well, contracts and others, regulations. And UNCITRAL, this is mostly a talk about some UNCITRAL work, deals with that. We had a model law in 1994, followed by another law in 2011. I think the law was very effective. I may return to that. But I think that's just as important. Generalities about goodness and kindness are wonderful, but getting people to behave well is, I suppose, what it's really all about. Commercial law is another topic in this program. It's usually private law. And indeed, the famous UNIDROIT principles, of which we've heard a great deal, essentially deal with international commercial contracts between private parties. Now, of course, the principles could be extended explicitly to deal with contracts with government, and procurement does generate, by the way, contracts with government. So there's already a little bit of a tension between rule of law, commercial law, private law, and procurement. And I say I want to talk principally about public procurement. What is public procurement? Essentially, it's the acquisition by government or its agencies, public procurement, of goods, services, and what non-Americans call civil works and we call construction in the United States. And the model laws developed by UNCITRAL deal with that. Now, as I mentioned before, there was an earlier law, this little red book, 1994, which I've heard described as the gold standard. I think, in point of fact, at least 60 countries reviewed that law in either producing new laws or reviewing their existing laws. And when we started this work in 1986, public procurement was in pretty bad shape in many countries. I could tell many stories. I'll just tell one. I went to Indonesia before then, and I say there were 10 ministries, or probably more. Lots of islands, they've all got to be represented. And each of the ministries probably had 5, maybe more bureaus. That meant 50 purchasers. They all had different rules, if they had any rules at all. Now, the world has come a long way since then, in large part, I would say, through the 1994 law, and now to some extent the 2011 law. Now, we've extended our work to a more sophisticated form of, if you will, purchasing or acquisition, which are now called public-private partnerships, which, when we started our work, were called privately financed infrastructure projects, and they're called many other things as well. And in a sense, one part of that, when you move to PPPs, we call them BOTs when we got started, is the government, to some extent, the purchaser, so-called, handing out some of the other functions, financing in particular, operation of the project. And UNCITRAL has dealt with all of that. And again, if you think about that, it begins to get, the subject gets almost larger than, quote, contract law, with all respects to Professor Bonnell and to the principles, but that's what we dealt with. Now, one other thing I should say, like all of the work which most of us do, this was an exercise in the harmonization of private law, commercial law, procurement law. But harmonization suggests several things. One, that nations have these laws. It also suggests, it raises a question, what does harmonization mean? Now, we discovered in procurement, many countries did not have mature procurement systems. To this day, not all have them, and they're always evolving. New techniques, new methods of purchasing are coming along. The other thing, I think, and we heard this from Secretary General Faria yesterday, in the beginning, this work was thought to be really comparative doctrinal work. I remember once meeting René David. Some of you will know him, a brilliant scholar, Frenchman. And I would say in the beginning, there was a great deal of comparative research done, as was suggested by Angelo Faria. And sometimes it was an attempt to reconcile doctrine. Well, it's almost like bringing together me and my sister-in-law. And I think we've moved away from that. I think we've moved to some, sort of looking for best practices, which of course arise out of national traditions, but we've moved to that, business practices, and have tried not to be too doctrinal, but just come up with things that will actually work. And I think enormous success has been achieved for that reason. And UNCITRAL, as UNIDROIT, draws into its work practitioners if it can. Now, one problem we had with public procurement, it's not really a field that is known to most practitioners, except those who specialize in government contracts. When I went to law school, we never took a course in government contracts. We didn't know what it was. So it was a little difficult. Unlike, for example, work in arbitration, where you have many practitioners, and they bring their knowledge and their interest in having clients to the table. This was not the case with procurement, and it was sometimes a question where the experts would come from. Procurement is a very important subject. It involves large percentages of government budget. Indeed, in many developing countries, large percentages of the gross domestic product. I often tell students, I run an institute, and we have many officials from all over the world who come to work on this subject. I say, you know, macroeconomists get the Nobel Prizes, but you guys are spending the money. It's very important work, hence my reference before to the importance of able public administration competence in the work that's done. And I think, quite frankly, the work that we have done with respect to the model law has probably promoted that to some extent. Maybe I should say a little bit more about what procurement is. As I mentioned, it's the acquisition of goods, services, and construction, but largely it's the selection of the contractor or the supplier. However, it of course embraces contracts, because typically a good solicitation document, which is what we call what's otherwise called in some places invitation to bid, tender documents. Tender, of course, really refers to the bidder and not to the government selector. But those solicitation documents, if well done, of course, include clearly drafted terms of the contract which the parties are bidding against. UNCITRAL the model law has a preamble, and some of the terms are very general, and I found quite often that delegates believed in these general terms. For example, one is to maximize economy and efficiency. The World Bank uses that expression. Value for money. You know, it's like so many terms that we deal with, if you examine them closely, they mean very little. Of course you want to be efficient. Yes, you want to have economy, spend less, get more. But it was one of our aims, and value for money became very fashionable. I suppose you're willing to pay more for more value or pay less for less value. Promoting competition, I say, is very important, and indeed, and that's one of the preambular terms. And indeed, I would say that a general definition of rule of law probably includes competition. Friedrich Hayek, a libertarian who is thought of as a Vienna school economist, hostile to government regulation. I mean, a liberal would call him an anarchist, and a conservative would call him a great man. But even Hayek believed you had to have competition laws, that the human beast does not like to compete, it prefers monopoly. And so one of our aims was to promote competition. Fair, equal, and equitable treatment for all. Well, of course, and that also is, I suppose, part of the rule of law. In other words, the solicitation documents have to be clear so that everyone understands them. If they don't understand them, they have the right to ask for clarification of the documents. The government then sends out the meaning. It clarifies the documents, and that is sent to everybody. Now, in the era of websites and email, this may become a little bit easier, or maybe it can be more easily manipulated, I'm not sure. But we definitely promoted that. And you don't ask for contracting. You do not ask for clarification after you have bid and won. And you say, by the way, I didn't really understand what the requirement was. If you'll give me a little bit more, I think I could sign this contract. Indeed, in a pure form of procurement, this would be my advice to you if you're doing this. If you're using tendering, where you specify what you want and you give the bid to the lowest bid who's responsive and is qualified. We said in the original model law, no negotiation after that. Now that requires discipline, and I would say that one of the things that is required in public procurement is discipline in the officials who do the procuring. You see already we're getting a little bit away from just contract terms and things like that. We're talking about public administration with respect to what is going to be a commercial relationship of sorts with the successful bidder. You've got to be tough in this business. Achieving transparency is one of our goals. That fits in with the topic. Now, as I've often said about transparency, it's a window. But what's important is what's behind the window, not the window itself. And a good procurement law will provide for all kinds of clear documents, competitive procedures, record keeping, very important. The right to challenge, to protest. Interestingly enough, when we started on this work in the 80s, most countries did not have provisions for protest if you were an unhappy bidder. And indeed, I was in the government. I drafted these things. And, excuse me, governments, my clients, I'm a lawyer, were engineers. I drafted procurement regulations for a government agency. They did not want people to protest. They thought protesters were wise guys trying to hold them up, be a nuisance. And in fact, even some very well-known experts in procurement. I had a colleague, Gösta Vesberg, from Sweden, who ran CEDA, and he wrote an article for the Public Procurement Law Review saying, we don't want government challenge. Who are these people? But in a world that has moved since Ronald Reagan and Maggie Thatcher to the private sector should be emboldened to challenge incorrect procurement decisions. They won't always do it because they want to do business with the government agency, and government agencies have a certain kind of leverage. But accountability is another phrase that we did not use in the law, but in the preamble. But accountability is ultimately you want the government to be responsible and accountable. In fact, I had a friend who was a high-ranking government official in the United States who once said that if a procurement system works well, it will not only promote accountability, it'll promote democracy. He worked in Eastern Europe at the time. This is in 1990, 91, 92. And he said in the past, the government procured from itself. Government agencies carried out the work. Now some of these former officials who had been in government agencies were now contractors bidding for work. There was provision made for parliamentary oversight, record keeping, the right to go to court, the right to hold the government to account. He said that's sort of part of democracy, and public procurement can do it. He was clearly an enthusiast for public procurement, but there's a little bit in that. Excuse me, let me just. Excuse me. You know, as I say, one of the 4 points of the compass is corruption, anti-corruption. I myself think that good, sound procurement laws with proper methods, that their aim is not in the first instance to prevent corruption. It's to create efficient, clear systems managed by competent people, and hopefully one consequence will be less corruption. I mean, I've dealt with a fair number of procurements, and I've certainly seen some what the World Bank used to call misprocurements. Very often the era is political more than financial. I would say in the light of an era of Panama Papers and the things we heard from Ms. Winhoven and others this morning from, I cannot pronounce the name, so I may not even try, but I might because I have it here, Mr. Kleischen. Procurement is a society-wide phenomenon. Corruption is, forgive me, and the real purpose of solid procurement laws and procurement systems and procedures and administration is not in the first instance to prevent bribery. It may be to maybe minimize collusion, you know, coming together. And in fact, petty bribes is not the major issue in big public procurement. Now, of course, there are some hideously corrupt procurements, but typically there, probably the problem is method. Now, one of the sort of intellectual challenges of a good procurement regime is to have, there's a trade-off, as in everything else in life. I remember once a German colleague saying that if you're a government buyer and acquirer, you want to get something that is cheap, good, and fast. But if you think about it, it's impossible to do that. Really, if you think about it hard, to do it fast, cheap, and hope it's going to be good. But there's another trade-off, and it's between rigor and sophistication. And by and large, government officials, I'm going to be indiscreet, in developing countries have not always in the past been trusted by the World Bank and others. And indeed, one of the points I should have made before is that this harmonization of topics like procurement is not just harmonization of existing doctrine. I point out there may not be any. It's essentially to develop models for the reform of countries. We're really, in many ways, the work of UNCITRAL and to a degree UNIDROIT is to provide models of best practice to enable countries to make their systems better. Now, if you're going to be careful, now in this, if you look at the model laws, there are about 11 different methods of procurement. Now, the strictest and the preferred is what they now call open tendering. We just called it tendering. You put out clear solicitation documents. They're clarified. The bids have to come in a certain period of time, and you give it to the lowest. The bidder should be qualified. You can pre-qualify, so you know they're all okay, big enough, experience, blah, blah, blah. Responsive. Responsiveness is a little bit more tricky. Is the bid responsive to the solicitation? I've often asked people, how do you know a bid is responsive? Well, they should say yes. You put out the solicitation out, and it can be this big, and you say, do you agree or not? Yes. At which point, the lowest price calculation, putting to one side other factors, a computer could do it. That would be the ideal, and there are many practitioners of procurement who think that's what you've got to do. On the other hand, in the modern world, with technology changing all the time, you get the temptation to be sophisticated. Our European brothers, Italy is one of our brothers, have come up with a method called competitive dialogue. That, if I were a strict, and I used to be, in charge of procurement, I wouldn't allow the person in the room who proposed it, but we have it in our new law. And essentially, it's sort of a combination of, I'll simplify, discussion. The would-be bidders, and I can give examples, and the government, which is buying, they keep on talking. Now, if you think about it, and there's a lot of money involved in some of these things, you think about it, if you want to talk about temptation of impropriety, it would, in my view, come in as they begin to discuss what the evaluation criteria are. The World Bank, until recently, I think, when it lost its nerve, would never finance competitive dialogue. But that is a trade-off, because in theory, the European Union directives have competitive dialogue. In theory, it means that your requests will be more responsive. Is it to the objective requirements of society, or is it to what the bidders would like to provide. So that is a trade-off, and I think it's a difficult one, and the law tries to indicate with some of the, how you determine what you should do. Just to finish up, and I could go on at great length, and I won't. Challenge has become increasingly important. The right to the unhappy bidder to challenge. The government has the right, however, to stop the challenge, another trade-off if it really wants to go forward, clearly an abuse, at which point the unhappy bidder has to come in and ask for damages. It's sometimes difficult to know what your damages are if you cannot demonstrate you would have been the low bidder if the thing had gone forward. So this is another issue. So to wrap up, is this an area of promoting the rule of law, of commercial law, minimizing corruption? And in my notes I say, yeah, it's an area of commercial law, but it goes beyond commerce. Maybe for some of the reasons mentioned by Ms. Winhoven, because you were talking about the responsibility of a state to its people to get the infrastructure and others done, which is a precondition, of course, of development. But it implicates public administration. Of course, you should be sensitive to corruption at all times, as you just go through life. And of course, because it is a body of government regulation and contracts that arise from it, it is a rule of law, has rule of law elements. But I would say it's a complicated phenomenon, a very important one. The UNCITRAL laws, I think I mentioned, studies were made to show that many, many countries have copied it, or I'm not so sure how many have copied the more recent version. It's very important, it involves large sums of money. It's an effort by lawyers to impose discipline. I think lawyers have done it. And therefore it's a subject which I would commend to your reading for pleasure. If you really want to enjoy this stuff, take something like this document, and when you fly home, read it. I find it much more enlightening than some of the stuff that my wife gives me to read. But anyway, thank you.
Thank you very much, Don. So we do have some time for questions or exchange with the audience. Are there any ideas? Yes, please, sir. I don't know if we have a microphone. If not, please shout. Well, please try to make yourself... here's a microphone coming your way. Microphone was intercepted.
Very good. First of all, thanks to the two speakers for two very interesting presentations, just with a view to stirring things up a bit. I wonder whether there are not two dangers to be perhaps avoided. One is the appearance of looking for what the English rather confusingly call motherhood and apple pie. That is to say, you know, we're looking for the best of everything in all possible worlds in every situation, because you paint an extremely ambitious picture, which, you know, is very good and very imaginative. But it's a huge amount. So I wonder whether it might be better to try to implement that in stages rather than presenting people with this enormous range of issues. My second worry is whether there's a risk of the concept of the rule of law being hijacked. The rule of law was invented, I think I'm right in saying, by the English constitutional lawyer Dicey, and he coined the phrase. And it was intended to, as Don said, it actually means a number of things. For example, equal treatment under the law. Nobody should be deprived of life, liberty or property without a fair trial, the independence of the judiciary and so on. The point is, these are all fundamental things. They're all very important things. I personally would be a little bit unhappy if we started introducing the concept of the rule of law, tying it to the enforcement of contractual rights and so on. In other words, I think we should reserve the concept of the rule of law to things that are fundamental to freedom, to liberty, to fair treatment, and so on, and not drag it in as a phrase for covering every aspect of commercial law, contract law, and so on. I'm sure that wasn't the intention, but I just wondered if there was a danger of being perceived to be too inclusive as a term.
Yeah, please. And then yeah, please.
Well, I certainly agree with the thrust of what Sir Roy has said, completely, by the way. To be a little parochial, we sometimes say in America that only countries that are in the tradition of Magna Carta are rule of law countries, you know, law of the land and all that kind of stuff. I will say this, I think it's non-lawyers who in many ways appreciate this concept more than we do. If I were a businessman or a banker and I was really annoyed by something that was happening to me, I'd probably say, if only we had the rule of law, which is sort of the point you're making. And I agree, I think it's really a portmanteau word. On the other hand, I've been involved in this business a long time. I remember once I did some work for Vice President Cheney's daughter, Liz Cheney, a very able woman until she decided to run for the Senate in Wyoming against someone who she thought was less conservative than she, and she got killed. But I remember talking to her and one of her colleagues, and they said, Professor Wallace, what is the relationship of contract law to democracy? You see, because what's happened is you had economic development. Then came Thatcher and Reagan, and suddenly we believe in the market, the rule of law, that sort of thing. I said, I don't know what the connection between contract and the rule of law, but I do believe in lawyers. In other words, we had a critical mass of professionally trained persons. This is why I emphasized competence in the beginning. Then you can, they'll be better maybe than non-lawyers, as I think someone suggested before. But I agree, it means so many different things. And probably one should limit it to independent judiciary, separation of powers, maybe, certainly in Washington, conservatives would say property rights. But the enforceability of contract is used by an awful lot of people, Sir Roy. I was in Texas once, 500 people, Russia and the rule of law. We want our, and I remember some guy said, I just started work in Czechoslovakia at that time, and I had to get guarantees from banks that my contracts would be enforced. That's what they thought it meant. But I agree, it becomes very dangerous. And on the other hand, you don't want to fault the UN for its ambitions. Better to have ambitions than not, but probably not to take them literally.
If I can just add an element of context in the UN, possibly for the reasons you mentioned, Sir Roy, that's we are actually slowly moving away from references to the rule of law concept, which is still useful for as an indication of what we want to cover in a meeting like this. But in United Nations negotiations, we found it increasingly difficult to tie our work to the mainstream rule of law debate, essentially for the reason that the mainstream rule of law debate is developing into a political minefield over the central issues you were referring to, when no one sees problems with the rule of law as we might understand it or as we might use it, for example, enforceability of contract and so on. Those are not problematic concepts, but making this part of a general rule of law agenda is sometimes not as helpful as we thought it might be, or not as helpful as it was, say, 5 to 10 years ago. So you will find less and less references to the concept, although we are still trying to produce exactly the same result, which is to promote fair and efficient commercial law as a tool for development and as a part of general United Nations activities. But when it comes to making that goal acceptable to certain states, it is probably easier to reach consensus going into more detail than simply using this catchy phrase of rule of law. Please, Ursula.
Thanks. I just wanted to share something that the Deputy Secretary General regularly says, actually on the topic of idealism, and he's a huge champion of the rule of law. And what he says is that that as UN civil servants, that we can't afford to look at the world through rose-colored glasses. But at the same time, we must have our eyes firmly fixed on the horizon on how the world should be, and we should do absolutely everything we can to close that gap. And the second thing is just to reiterate that in terms of, for instance, business for the rule of law, this is not talking about charity. This is really much emphasizing that this is a business issue. And some research was done by the law firm Hogan Lovells that found that rule of law, along with corruption issues and peace and stability, were the top 3 concerns that concern companies when they're deciding where to invest.
Thank you. I think Professor Opati was deprived of the microphone, so please, you have the floor.
Merci. Je voudrais dire quelque chose sur les relations entre les droits internationaux privés et les droits internationaux publics à ce point-là. Parce qu'il me semble que nous sommes en présence de contrats qui sont entre parties privées, basiquement. L'autonomie de la volonté pourrait être une façon d'orienter la régulation. Mais en même temps, vous avez besoin d'avoir certains codes de conduite. Est-ce que vous pensez que la manière d'aboutir à ce résultat est un code pensé prenant en compte basiquement l'intérêt des personnes qui sont parties des commerces ou les États? Parce que les États, en définitive, sont chargés de mettre en force les choses que les parties ont convenues. Je pense que nous devons voir les limites entre les Nations Unies à ce point et les États. Parce que je pense que nous sommes en présence d'une chose un petit peu large, un petit peu indéfinie. C'est seulement mon commentaire.
Well, I think Renaud was trying to say that in UNCITRAL in its work and UNIDROIT in its work. Of course, we're all inspired by high purpose and ideals. And the question is, how can you reduce them to a practical point where they will change behavior? And law is certainly one way, we know that. Law disciplines the undisciplined. I would say public procurement is not a bad example, because on the one hand, it gives rights to the private party. The contractor can challenge, he can insist on clear documents. He can certainly, if corruption is revealed, he can go to the law authorities. On the other hand, it's really there to further the interests of government, the government, of course, acting for the people collectively. So I think procurement is not a bad area of both public law and private law, really. It has contract elements. We have the Incoterms are usually in the contract. Even the UNIDROIT principles are known to people in the field of construction laws, we've learned, and at the same time, it's public administration. But I think this is the challenge, and I think a great deal has been achieved, in my honest opinion. At lunchtime, I was talking about original sin. I was interested to learn that President Obama, and I'm a Republican, but I admire him, used the expression on television the other day, we're all afflicted by original sin, coming from the head of state, as an interesting observation. So that is the condition of life, but I think we have created frameworks. Economic development has helped. Today, market orientation is favored. The rule of law, I think, is an attempt really, someone said it was applied reason law. It's an attempt to really impose widely understood principles of of morality, really, on the conduct of business as between the government and the private sector. So I think it can achieve that. And even Anglo-Saxons, as opposed to Uruguayans, even Anglo-Saxons know that, even though they don't admit it. Thank you.
Monsieur le Président, microphone. Microphone for the...
I have a question for Mrs. Venhoven. I understand that the UN Global Compact is based on the idea that individuals or entities spontaneously undertake to comply with the 10 principles and with a number of applications of those 10 principles. And I also understand that the idea is to spontaneously promote compliance. So the fundamental goal is to improve the behaviors. But on a very banal level, if there is no compliance with the spontaneous undertaking, in the experience of your office, is the only sanction available the sanction of social reputation, a reputational sanction, or would it be possible, and if so, in the affirmative, in which important countries it would be possible to enforce legally the violation of a spontaneous undertaking? Because if, as I believe, that kind of sanction is possible, it is not the real sanction, but it would help quite a bit to make those undertakings to look very important, or more important than they may appear. It would have also an educational purpose, I think, to affirm that principle, that you cannot lightly, spontaneously undertake to do things and then betray your undertaking.
Thank you for the question. Firstly, on the spontaneous thing, I feel that word makes me feel a bit uncomfortable, because the whole notion of this, it's a serious undertaking that companies make, and I don't think they make it lightly, including because the reality is they'll get more attention and more scrutiny for actually making this commitment. So I think a company that didn't intend to take these kinds of actions would be better off staying below the radar and not coming forward and making a public commitment that then others can hold up to them and where they're going to have to report. So the kind of drivers that lead companies to take these kinds of actions, I mean, sometimes it is regulation. I mentioned, for instance, there's the Modern Slavery Act in the UK, and there's various other pieces of legislation, and a lot of the Global Compact principles in particular countries are covered by law already: child labour, forced labour, etc., non-discrimination. But other drivers include the business case, consumers, the enlightened CEOs and their commitments, investors, etc. So there are a whole wide range of drivers why companies would want to take these kinds of actions. And every day in the media, more issues are unfolding. The court of public opinion is holding companies accountable, even sometimes when legal courts cannot do so. Secondly, I think there's also further hardening of these requirements into law that we are seeing. But even there will always be a complementary need for voluntary initiatives like the Global Compact, because law often says what to do, but it doesn't tell you how to do it usually. And that's often for good reason, because how to do it may evolve, or maybe it's not even known at this point what the best way to do it is. So our initiative very much focuses on how you do this. What are the policies and processes you need to have in place to ensure that you can meet these kinds of commitments? And that includes even where those commitments are actually already in law. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last question. I understand Mr. Harris was willing to intervene.
Yes. I was interested to hear from Professor Sir Roy Good about perhaps we are moving away from the rule of law as it was when I was at university. But my sense is that we're moving into a world where there is going to be constant criticism and focus from civil service organizations, and we've seen it only in the last 2 weeks in connection with the Panama Papers, that however within the legal frameworks people were acting when they acted, they are still being held responsible. We've seen it as an institution. The World Bank Group is constantly under pressure from civil society organizations. And sometimes we feel that organizations like the United Nations and like the work that was done on the human rights role of human rights in business is taken to a level that is putting huge strains on business. Certainly the cost of dealing with consequences is a huge cost. And again, it was interesting to see or to hear from Ms. Van Hoven that the role of the General Counsel in business is increasing to become very much an advisor to the board. Do the panel see that at some stage those who are trying to bring together standards and norms that aren't totally rule of law will ever feel the need to stand up and say, we must support businesses or certain businesses in certain stages of their development because they have gone as far as they can go in the economic environment in which we work? Or are they going to be setting norms and leaving it to business to deal with the consequences?
Sure. I think including the human rights work that you're talking about, the guiding principles on business and human rights, which emphasize that all companies everywhere, regardless of size, sector, location, etc., have a responsibility to respect human rights, which means that they have to do due diligence to be able to know and show that they're respecting human rights. And I think that standard is really, a restatement of the old concept of you broke it, you bought it. And so I don't think it is so much asking too much that if companies are causing social and environmental externalities, that there's a expectation that companies will take responsibility for that and address those issues. And I think if they don't take that on themselves, I think the advance of law can increasingly make them have to do it. The other thing I was going to say is I definitely think there is a move by a lot of civil society to work with companies much more closely than ever before on the how you actually do this. And of course, there's always going to be those NGOs who are more of a kind of campaign orientation, but many more, in recent years have been working really specifically with companies to help identify the negative impacts, but also to help them identify opportunities, including through their value chain or decent work, to actually have positive impacts on society and the environment, recognizing that companies are crucial drivers of economic development. I'm remembering something that the former Secretary General said, Kofi Annan. He said, it's the absence of broad-based business, not its presence, that condemns half of humanity to poverty. And I think a lot of, for instance, NGOs in the development space are recognizing that. And so many more of them now have specific partnership arms that are working concretely with companies to really leverage this power of the private sector.
I'm a great optimist, and I wish we could all be optimists, but in principle, I don't think I agree with the thrust of your observations, Mr. Harris. Undoubtedly, civil society, which is more active all the time, though cynics would say that it's enabled by the profits of the capitalist system, have the ability to shame. And you see it with respect to climate change and green. I think the green movement has influenced business, although themselves, the executives of these companies are as concerned with climate change as anyone else. But otherwise I don't think I agree. I think businesses are tough, individual entrepreneurs are tough, competition is getting tougher. I don't see British Petroleum, to take a British example, having behaved in a most responsible way with respect to the spill. They denied it, and there are many examples like that. When I went to law school, I went to Harvard Law School, I had an old-fashioned professor of criminal law who said to us, the criminal code is the backbone of the moral code. And while the American preference is towards disclosure, for example, rather than criminal punishment, I think human life suggests something like that will always be the case. And indeed, competition is more ferocious all the time. And you don't have to be a crook to cut corners. So I just don't think this is going to solve. I mean, it's all very well and good. And I certainly would teach it to my children along with little fuzzy animals, little rabbits and stuff like that, which we do give children. I think human nature is not going to, it can help. Also, you don't have just gigantic corporations which can afford this, corporate councils and responsibility. You have lots of new businesses coming from new countries. live in different parts of the world, and this is, I don't think the world is there yet. Maybe it'll get there in the time of my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren. We'll see.
On that point, I think we have to close this panel. I would thank the audience for a very lively participation. I ask you to join me in thanking our speakers for very lively presentations, and I would invite Mr. Bernasconi to take the chair.